Your wage is not the value of your work. It is the lowest amount your employer believed you would accept without leaving. That sentence will feel wrong to some people. It should. The feeling of wrongness is worth examining because it points at the gap between how wages are explained and how they are actually determined. And the gap is not small. The standard economic account of wages goes like this. In a competitive labor market, wages reflect marginal productivity, the additional value a worker adds to output. An employer will pay a worker up to the value they produce because paying more would be unprofitable, and competition will push wages toward that value because another employer would otherwise hire the worker away. The wage, on this account, is a measurement. It reads off the worker's contribution to production and pays accordingly. This is intellectually coherent and empirically partial. It captures something real about how wages respond to skill scarcity and productivity differences. A surgeon earns more than a cleaner partly because the marginal product of surgical skill is genuinely higher. The framework is not invented. It describes a real mechanism that operates in labor markets. But it describes that mechanism in isolation from the other mechanism running simultaneously. The one that determines not what a worker is worth, but what a worker will accept. Henry Ford doubled wages at his factory in 1914. He paid $5 a day when the market rate was about half that. The productivity of his workers did not double. Their output per hour did not suddenly justify twice the wage by any marginal analysis. What happened was that Ford decided that the cost of turnover, the constant hiring and training of workers who left for better conditions, exceeded the cost of paying above market wages. The wage was not set by productivity. It was set by a calculation about retention and labor stability that had nothing to do with what the workers were worth and everything to do with what Ford needed from them. The story is instructive not because it is unusual, but because it is transparent. Ford's reasoning survives in his own writings. Most wage-setting reasoning does not. Most of it happens in compensation discussions that workers are not party to, guided by salary benchmarking data, industry norms, and assessments of what the candidate will accept, which the employer learns through the application process and negotiation. The worker who asks for too little gets what they asked for. The worker who asks for too much loses the offer. The wage that results is the outcome of an information asymmetry in which the employer typically knows more about what they would be willing to pay and what comparable employers are paying than the worker knows about what they could reasonably demand. Glassdoor and LinkedIn have partially addressed this asymmetry. They have not eliminated it. Now take the counter-argument seriously. In genuinely competitive labor markets with low barriers to worker mobility, employers cannot persistently pay below productivity for long without losing their workers to competitors who will pay more. The competition for talent in skilled fields does bid wages upward. The engineer who can move between 5 employers is in a fundamentally different negotiating position than the warehouse worker whose skills are less differentiated and whose options are fewer. Human capital investment, education, training, the accumulation of rare skills, genuinely improves a worker's negotiating position by increasing both their productivity and their outside options. The marginal productivity framework also correctly predicts that wages in growing, competitive industries tend to rise as demand for labor increases, and wages in contracting industries tend to fall. These predictions are directionally accurate. The mechanism is real. The question is whether the mechanism is the primary driver of wage outcomes across the economy, or whether it is one force operating inside a structure shaped equally by bargaining power, institutional arrangements, and historical contingencies that the clean theory does not capture. The evidence of the last 50 years makes the answer difficult to avoid. From roughly 1945 to 1975, in the United States, productivity, median wages, more on average, earned more. The relationship was not perfect, but it was present. The gains of growth were distributed, imperfectly but genuinely, across the income distribution. After 1975, the relationship broke. Productivity continued to rise. Median wages largely stagnated in real terms. The economy kept growing. The gains of that growth went somewhere. They did not go to wages, not in proportion to what productivity growth would have predicted. They went to profits, to capital returns, to the compensation of those at the very top of the income distribution: executives, financial sector workers, owners of capital. The Economic Policy Institute has tracked this divergence in detail. Between 1979 and 2020, productivity in the United States rose by roughly 62%. Compensation for the median worker rose by roughly 17%. The gap between those two numbers represents value that workers produced and did not receive. It went somewhere. Tracing where it went is tracing the political economy of the last half-century. Unions declined. Union density in the private sector in the United States fell from roughly 35% in the mid-1950s to under 720. Unions are the primary institutional mechanism through which workers collectively exercise bargaining power, through which the individual worker's weak negotiating position is aggregated into something that can more nearly match the employer's structural advantage. Their decline did not just affect union members. Research consistently shows that union density in a region raises wages for non-union workers in the same industry, because non-union employers have to compete for workers who have union employment as an alternative. When that alternative shrinks, the floor it provided shrinks with it. Minimum wage legislation, adjusted for inflation, peaked in purchasing power in the late 1960s and has not recovered. The legal floor beneath wages fell in real terms while productivity rose. Capital mobility, the ability of corporations to move production to lower wage locations, gave employers a credible alternative to paying domestic wages. You do not need to actually move a factory to use the threat of moving it as a wage suppression tool. The credible threat is sufficient. Workers in an economy integrated into global supply chains negotiate against a backdrop of an implicit comparison to what workers in other countries will accept for the same work. Each of these developments is separately documentable. Together they describe a shift in the balance of power between capital and labor that produced the divergence between productivity and wages. The marginal productivity theory predicts that wages track productivity. Wages did not track productivity. The framework that says wages measure what workers produce cannot explain why workers receive less than they produce when the institutional conditions of bargaining shift in favor of employers. Here is the floor move. The wage is not only an economic fact, it is a social relationship, and the specific social relationship it encodes determines what kind of life is possible for the person receiving it. The wage determines time. How much of your waking life is owned before it is yours? The worker who earns enough to cover their needs in 40 hours per week inhabits a fundamentally different relationship to time than the worker who must work 60 hours to cover the same needs. Both may be paid what their labor is worth by some measure. The difference in time, the hours of life not pledged to production, is not a small thing. It is the material of everything that is not work: family, rest, health, thought, pleasure, the things that make the working hours worth enduring. The wage also determines optionality. The worker who earns significantly above their basic needs can afford to leave a bad job, take a risk on a new path, weather an income gap between positions. The worker whose wage precisely meets their obligations cannot. The person with no savings to buffer a job loss cannot walk out of a situation they find intolerable. The financial margin is the freedom margin. Where the wage leaves no margin, there is no freedom in the practical sense, regardless of what the formal employment contract says about voluntary participation. And the wage determines health in ways that are measurable and direct. Chronic financial stress produces chronic physiological stress. The worker under persistent wage pressure, always calculating, always at the edge, always one unexpected expense from crisis, is not simply financially constrained. They are living in a state of chronic activation of stress response that has well-documented consequences for cardiovascular health, immune function, mental health, and longevity. The low-wage worker dies earlier, on average, than the high-wage worker, not only because of different access to healthcare, because the experience of financial precarity has metabolic consequences that compound across a lifetime. None of this appears in the labor market model. The model shows a price and a quantity. It does not show the texture of the life that the price makes possible or forecloses. Now go to what wages are becoming under the conditions we examined when we looked at automation and gig work. The traditional employment relationship bundled several things together: a wage, job security, benefits, a degree of legal protection, and an implicit commitment of mutual investment. The employer trained the worker invested in the firm's success. The unbundling of that package, through contract work, through gig platforms, through the reclassification of employment relationships that strips away everything except the wage, is a specific distribution of the gains and costs of the employment relationship, in which the employer retains the flexibility while the worker absorbs the instability. The wage on a gig platform looks like a payment for work. It does not include the pension, the health insurance, the paid sick leave, the protections against arbitrary termination. The hourly rate may appear comparable or even higher than an equivalent employed rate. The total compensation, including the risk exposure, the absence of benefits, and the cost of self-managing the instability, is not. This is a wage in the narrowest possible definition, a transaction rather than a relationship, which is what the employer preferred and what the worker accepted because the alternative was not having the work. The question you carry from here is not political. It is not about minimum wages or union policy or gig economy regulation. Those are consequential debates, but they are downstream of the question underneath them. The number that arrives in your account each month, what does it tell you about your position in the negotiation? Not what you produced, not what you are worth in any durable sense, what your employer calculated you would accept. And the more unsettling version of the same question, if you knew exactly what your employer would have been willing to pay, the maximum they had budgeted, the number they would have agreed to rather than lose you, would the number in your account look different? For most people, the answer is yes. The question is what to do with that.